Ready when you are, Mayor.
Okay. All right, it is 3 o'clock. I would like to call to order the special study session on July 21st, and roll call vote, please.
Councilmember Bouders?
Here.
Councilmember Donahue?
Here.
Councilmember Medina?
Here.
Vice Mayor Martinez?
Here.
And Mayor Pats.
I'm here. Okay. Do I have a motion for approval of the final agenda?
So moved.
So moved.
Okay.
Second.
And a second? Vote, please.
Councilmember Bouders?
Aye.
Councilmember Donahue?
Aye.
Councilmember Medina?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Martinez?
Aye.
And Mayor Pats.
Aye. Any ex parte communications? Member Martinez? Vice Mayor Martinez?
Mr. Mayor, I received about upwards of 75 emails from members of the public for this item, and many of them were in the form of a form letter, but I responded to many of them and let people know about this meeting. Thank you.
Okay. Member Medina?
Same emails, and I've had some discussions with EPOA.
Great. Member Bouders, and then I'll come back to Member Donahue.
Same as Member Martinez, and I also had a conversation with Brian Hoffer at Secure Justice.
And Member Donahue?
Same as Member Martinez.
So I've had the same conversations as Member Martinez. I received an email from Mr. Hoffer, and I've spoken to some people at Co-Housing about this as well. Okay. Now we've come to public comment. I'm going to ask the clerk whether we have an email or online speaker cards that have been received regarding the consent items or items not listed on tonight's agenda. And anyone that would like to provide audio comment at this time can use the Zoom raise your hand feature, or if joining by phone, press *9. All speakers are limited to 3 minutes per speaker. Speakers will automatically be muted at the conclusion of their remarks. And are there any public speakers queued at this time?
There are none in the online comments. Let me check. Attendees, I see no raised hands at this time.
Okay, so that brings us to the study session. And I want to quickly do a few mayoral comments before we dive right in. My hope for today, and I guess I will fully take responsibility, was to continue our conversations on policing practices and their intersection with race and communities of color. And I was not as explicit on that, I think, when both talking to staff and when we took items from the council. So I want to sort of say what I understand the goals for today to be, and that is we're going to talk about where we are as a city and what data we currently are tracking and provide some of that information to us. We're going to be mapping out and reviewing our policing policies and really begin to have sort of the conversation of how do we shape those. And for me, it's about continuing the conversation and taking action. And so normally I would do a big spiel about having any of these conversations. In my education world, we talk about sort of the 4 agreements and how you shape these conversations. That's not quite appropriate for a public meeting. But to me, I think it's really important that as we have people from the community speak, as members of the council speak, that it come from the heart and they speak their experience and their truth and feel comfortable doing that. I think it's really important that we as a council and that the chief of police who's new to Emeryville with us, these conversations can be uncomfortable, but that's how we know that we're having the right conversation. So please be prepared to have some experiences of discomfort. I've been in education for a long, long time. And while I have a very high opinion of myself, the number of times that I have been called a racist over the years because I'm part of a system that's in that world has made me uncomfortable, but made it all the more important that I listen to what the person has to say and look at our practice to think about what we can do. And then finally, I think it's really important that we accept and expect some non-closure today. But I don't want to leave things hanging. We are not going to solve all of the challenges in the world in one study session. But Sherry, would you please share the action plan document? One of the things I would like to do throughout this conversation is as we have items that we want to talk about or schedule, is that we walk away here with a map of where we're going to go. So I've been working with Sherry as a way to display this. And so what I'm going to do is take notes on this of things that we need to do, what body we're going to assign it to. We're going to give it a priority level that we can change as we go through, and when we expect to do this. So these are some of the things, and please note, this is a draft. This is not a final. This was just sort of jotting down some things of what we're going to talk about. Updating the misdemeanors in our municipal code. I think that's a great thing. That's something that has to go to council, come back around, and I think we should do that as a high priority. And so we would talk about it at one of our September meetings. We talked about booking photos, not quite something we can do immediately because there's more agencies and entities involved, but it is something we want to look at. And again, it's something that's going to have to come from the whole council. Whereas talking about establishing annual reporting, something that was put out there, this might be something that we begin to discuss at public safety first. And again, this is a draft. This is just so you guys can see how this will work. I will make changes as we are talking and update things as we hit them. And then we can sort of end the meeting coming back to this list to make sure, one, I've captured everything we want to do, and that we put some really clear who's going to work on this and what is their time frame. Can I get sort of a nod that this makes sense to you and that you guys want to do it this way? I love that none of you followed directions. I said nod, you all went like this. That is perfect. That is good civil disobedience. All right, Sherry, thank you for sharing that. Let me go back to our agenda. That brings us to item 6.1, and I think I'm going to hand it over eventually to the chief, but I'll start with the city manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We have a presentation for you tonight. The slides were made available with the republishing of the agenda last Thursday. So that's been made available to the council and the public. As the mayor indicated, this is in large part an overview to provide some information to commence the conversation and to start refining what policy development the council would like us to undertake as an organization. But to get us going, Chief Schroeder and I thought that it would be helpful to provide some information to start that conversation. We do not have all of the information today that we would like to have or that we will have in the future. So we acknowledge that there are some gaps in the presentation. But with that said, I would like to hand this over to Chief Schroeder. This is his presentation, and we are all available to take questions at the end.
Thank you. Thanks, Mayor, council members, and city manager. I think I agree with the city manager. It is an overview of a lot of different topics that are impacting law enforcement right now and impacting really the community that they serve. So the goal today is to kind of present some of these at high level and then maybe drill down at later meetings or other discussions, depending on what council wants to do as we go through the process. So Sherry, do I just say next slide and is that what happens?
Yes, that'd be great.
Okay, next slide, please. As an overview regarding the department, I know there were some questions. One, the makeup of the organization itself and who actually is the Emeryville Police Department as far as positions, but also about hiring, how many of those we currently have and separations from the organization. And that's what the graph is off to the side. Generally, separations can be anything from retirements to medical retirements or to lateraling to another agency. For the most part, staffing has a tendency to retain at Emeryville, so that's a good thing. Next slide, please. So as a backdrop, when you're talking about complaints and use of force and these kinds of topics, one of the backdrops that you really have to look at is what does the Emeryville Police Department do every day? How do they respond? What do they respond to? And if you look at the calls for service, on average, you're about 30,000 calls for service annually that the department responds to. About 7,000 of those, I'm just looking at 2018, are 911 calls. And out of all the calls for service, about 800 on average annually arrests are made, depending on what the calls are. 4,000 plus or minus reports are issued, and citations in around the 500 range, depending on what year it is. You can see the parking citations that are also issued there. Next slide, please. So how do you get the department in many ways? The department is made up of people. And the vast majority of what we do is when we talk about training and what training we provide makes a big difference. Now, if you look on the right, it says post-mandated training hours. And if you look, 40 hours every 2 years is not a significant amount. And that's significantly higher than most other states. Post requires a lot of a variety of different items when it comes to training. But really what's important is when you look at what departments invest in the organization, because that's really talks about what's important to the community and what's important to the management and the officers in the department. And if you look, when you talk about the additional hours that goes into it, 40 hours or 20 hours per year is post-mandated, but another 145 hours plus or minus goes into training officers in a variety of different areas. And to break that out becomes a pretty complex math problem. And when you talk about what post requires for de-escalation, for example, versus what the Emeryville Police Department requires for de-escalation, there are differences there. And when you look at some of the crisis intervention, communication, training, transforming communities and policing, emotional intelligence, these kinds of things are what Emeryville Police Department values and puts in training dollars. All departments are going to be required to do some range training, some, a variety of things there. But how you build in, escalation as well as de-escalation training plans is very important in how you deliver the services to the community. So I know Emeryville coming here, I know Chief Tejada was very interested in wellness. So there was a significant investment in wellness training and kind of getting officers to understand the impact sometimes the job has and how that impacts how they deliver services. So you'll see that where wellness is about 12% of the training. Also leadership, investigative skills, which also play out in how we deliver services. Next slide, please. I should probably go back one slide, Sherry. I want to mention one thing on that, the training. I'm currently starting doing interviews with officers in the department and listening to kind of some of the things that they talk about, what's important to them, what we do right, where can we make improvements. And training has come up quite a bit as both a positive for the way they deliver services to the community. Officers are saying that it works for them, but it's also, they're also expressing it in, they know a lot of change is coming down the road, and knowing what that is and how training will play a part in how they deliver those services is a big thing that they've expressed during some of those interview processes. So next slide. So then we start moving into our use of force policy, and some of the highlights on the use of force policy is the policy provides guidelines for reasonable use of force. Our policy spells out things like the value and dignity of human life, that officers have a duty to intercede and report to a supervisor when they observe force that's objectively unreasonable. And officers shall only use the amount of force that's reasonably appears necessary based on the totality of circumstances. And officers may use objectively reasonable force to effect an arrest, prevent escape, or overcome resistance. And these are built into the penal code as well as our policy. But you also see some legislative changes coming down the road in this, where Assembly Bill 1022 will talk about, some of the reporting requirements and things like that when it comes to use of force and what happens on those. So there is legislative change surrounding some of this. Next slide, please. So then we talk about the types of use of force. And these are use of force that are basically any patrol officer during the normal course of duty can use to perform their job to some degree. And it ranges dramatically, as you can imagine, from anywhere from a firm grip where somebody just takes somebody by the arm and escorts them to the car and places them under arrest, to pain compliance. And in our policy, it talks about using only the amount of pain compliance. This is where defensive tactics instructors, these are control holds and things like that, can only use the amount to overcome the resistance. This may also include taking individuals to the ground to effect an arrest. And you'll see this when I show you the data sets around force. Additionally, OC spray, batons, beanbag, and tasers are used. And specifically, you notice in here that the carotid is not listed. And in our policy at this point, it's not authorized since it's not being certified by post. And there is legislative changes that potentially will prohibit it from being used at all. It also adds some other legislative changes talking about crowd control and the use of different less lethal options. And then lethal force, which becomes, the one that is the most challenging to kind of get people's minds around. But it may be used to protect himself or herself or others to protect against imminent threats of death or seriously bodily injury. Where feasible, the officer should identify themselves and warn that deadly force may be used. There's a whole host of reporting and investigative steps when an officer discharges a firearm that goes into play. Next slide, please, Sherry. When we talk about other less lethal force options, this is when you're talking about specific purpose things that they're generally built in part of an operational plan for events like crowd control. And tools that the officers have available to them is a 40 millimeter launcher. And this is where you see the rubber batons or smoke or gas that are available to them. Now, when I say that's available to them, but it's only available because there's 4 officers that have the ability to use them now in the department and 1 that can deploy gas based on the level of training. It requires over 100 hours of specialized training to be able to deploy those things. That's why they're deployed during a specialized or planned event and usually at the authorization level in management. Next slide, please. So probably more important in what we're doing here is how you report it and what gets reported, how we track it, and things like that. So officers, they're required, any use of force shall be documented, and they have to notify a supervisor if there's a visible injury, complaint of pain, or use of taser, or if they reasonably believe that the individual experienced more than just discomfort. They are required to get medical attention for the individuals. So that's all built into the policy also. Next slide, please. The supervisor's responsibilities, they should respond to the scene when force is used out in the field. And their job is to obtain the basic facts from the individual. And that is so that they can get the totality of picture of it. They're not just reading the officer's report, making the assumption that it occurred that way. Instead, they're getting an interview with the person if they can. They're ensuring that they're being medically treated, and they're also ensuring photographs are taken of the injuries. They're responsible for reviewing the initial report and reviewing it for all the circumstances surrounding it and making sure it complies with the policy. Now, the graph I should put on off to the side shows you there is additional review processes. So the supervisor does the report, reviews it, then it gets reviewed by the lieutenant and sent back if it needs additional follow-up and or information in order to make a determination based on the policy. Then it's reviewed by the captain, and ultimately in this department, I review them. The last step is there's a use of force committee that the department has, and that's made up of all the trainers and a command staff member, and then they review it to see if there's training options, things that they can glean from it. There's changes to the policy that need to come about. And then they look at all the use of force based on that. And actually right now, I just talked to them about looking at some of the legislative changes coming down and how those would be applied to our training as well as our policies. Next slide, please. So here's the types of force used by year. So you can see when I talked about the control holds and taking somebody to the ground, the vast majority of force that we use is taking somebody to the ground to effect the arrest. And that's just getting control of them so that we can get them under control with the least amount of force used. And as you can see, year to year, there's kind of a descending order there. Next slide, please. And that's another way of looking at it. When you look at total numbers, so between 17 and 19, it's basically 67 times we had to take somebody to the ground to get them under control. And then it kind of goes through the other items there: personal body weapons, taser, canine, or baton. So then we move into personnel complaints. By definition, a personnel complaint is basically any allegation where misconduct or job performance, it would result in discipline or a policy violation. They can be made in a variety of ways. And I noticed that I put it in a couple different places here, but they can be made anonymously. That seems to be one of the questions that comes up a lot. We will accept them, we will write them up, and we will investigate any complaint when it comes down to it. All the complaints that meet those definitions are documented and eventually followed through all the way up to my level. Now, they can be handled in a couple different ways, and we'll go into it in the next slide. It's both informally and formally, depending on the nature of the complaint, and I'll explain that in the next slide. Next slide, please, Sherry. So informal complaints, a good example of an informal complaint is when somebody calls up and they say, I got a ticket and I don't deserve it. And when the sergeant's talking to the person, they work through it, and ultimately, was the officer rude? No. Did they? So basically, it's your opinion is you didn't deserve the ticket. Well, that's resolved at court. That becomes a fairly low or informal complaint. There are other complaints where the sergeant looks at the body-worn camera footage and goes, okay, we'll talk it over with the officer, and we can talk it as a training issue. Or can rise all the way up to a documented counseling by the officer where they make a note for their eval folder saying you could have done a better job. Here's the expectation in the future. Formal complaints are a little different. They're usually an allegation that requires much more serious in nature, generally require formal investigations where a peace officer bill of rights kick in, and you're doing a much more robust investigation into that. And it can result all the way from no further action taken, meaning that the investigation didn't turn up that the allegation was correct and or corroborated, all the way up to terminating the officer. Next slide, please. So I should mention on the last one, there is some legislative changes coming about, or at least in where you're talking about different levels of reporting to post regarding, this is where you hear about decertification of officers and these kinds of things. And these are the legislative changes that are potential when it comes to complaints and terminations. When I looked at the complaint process at Emeryville, it's a pretty robust system. They got it in place. Things are in place. And the only thing I really added from my perspective was adding a letter to the complainant, letting them know that we've looked into it and either agree that we could have done better and or that we found that they were within policy, so that we're closing the loop with the complainant. When I got here, we weren't doing that. So you kind of lend yourself to complainants not understanding or not knowing what happened with the complaint. So we did add that step in there. So here's the complaint data, 2017 to 2020. So, if you're looking at it, you're looking at basically 16 complaints in 2017, just to give you an example. 11 of them were exonerated. Now, exonerated, we're going to talk a little bit about this at the very last slide, but Exonerated generally means that, like for a use of force complaint, that force was used on somebody, but it was within policy and it was within the guidelines set forth by the department. So yes, force was used. The officer was exonerated because it was within policy. Unfounded is generally when somebody makes a complaint and based on the body worn camera footage and the totality of circumstances, it didn't happen that way. So you can do an unfounded complaint that way. And then sustained is the officer was at fault or did some aspect of what the allegation was. Next slide, please. So there were some questions from council members about mutual aid requests. And in this area, and certainly in my experience, Alameda County Sheriff's Office coordinates for the region. So typically, for example, like in northern Sonoma County, you would respond to the jurisdictional authority, your county agency. In this county, it just happens to be Alameda. If they can fulfill the request, and they can be very specific, meaning I need 40 officers for traffic control. In my case, during the Tubbs fire, I needed 300 officers for security and control of entrances and a lot of different issues. So I make that request to Sonoma County Sheriff's Department back then. They can't fulfill it, so they make a request to Alameda, and then it goes out to the region to supply that. So any request from Alameda County Sheriff's Department regarding mutual aid goes to the department liaison. In this incident, it's Captain Collins, who is the liaison. And then ultimately management has to determine whether or not we're going to respond based on what's needed, what the issues are, and whether or not we can afford to do that based on our own needs. So it may be something very specific. I need, 20 motor officers. Well, we have one. Can we afford to send them to the event? So we have to make those determinations, and that's made at a management level. When employees do go, their policies follow with them. They don't get to go under different umbrella policies while they're performing mutual aid. And for us in 2018, just looking at the data on that, we responded once. I think it was the traffic control for the Warriors victory parade in 2018, and then 2 responses. One was for the Kincaid fire for traffic control and protests in Berkeley, and then none. We didn't respond at all in 2020, and most of those requests came in the last couple of months. Next slide, please. There was also some questions regarding oversight and accountability. Generally considered civilian oversight is the way they're usually spelled out. And it ranges in anywhere from a single auditor to a separate organization. And it's really the goals are the same. And this came straight from the book that I listed down on the bottom. And it's really to create a learning organization that takes appropriate action. You shouldn't have to be told to take appropriate action. You should be looking constantly and learning how to provide better services and taking the right action and making sure that you're addressing what the community needs are. But in some ways, auditing helps kind of determine that you're on the right track in that area. It also creates community trust that, there's somebody else looking at the organization from a lot of different areas and creates that organizational legitimacy. Now, I certainly have an opinion in this area that it starts in many ways with city council, that the department has to provide enough information for you to be able to kind of look at the organization and determine if we're doing the right things for this particular community. Next slide, please. And we talk about data for race. And this was a learning experience, even for me, as I kind of went through the research in this area. And we do have some data sets and some things to present today, but the CAD system right now, although you can pull demographics for citations out, you would have to hand sort by race. So that is a significant work product. to be able to get that data set. And then we have a limited ability to analyze the data. Every time I'm asking the person that does it, I'm taking her away from her primary responsibility. So that is one of the challenges in providing some of the data sets that, and frankly, in my experience, I'm used to being able to provide on a regular basis. The other thing is data for detentions or just plain contacts is not tracked by race. So you wouldn't know the race of just a consensual contact or somebody that, is detained but not arrested and or cited. You wouldn't have that information currently. Now, a lot of this changes under Assembly Bill 953. Starting in April of 2022, we're going to have to come up with solutions in order to be much more robust in how we track data. And this is everything from contacts to detentions to citations to arrests. All has to be tracked by race, gender, sexual orientation. There's a whole host of things that go into those categories that have to be tracked. And currently we don't have the capacity to do that. So that's something we're going to have to work towards in the future. We'll have to do our first report out in April of 2023. And that's all departments our size will have to do that. So you'll start seeing much more robust data across the state in this area. So to give context to it, we included the arrest data by charge. And you see the spikes here where the vast majority are really warrant arrests. Those are warrants that are in the system issued by the court. And then your larceny is everything from car burglaries to commercial burglaries, breaking into a commercial complex. And the vast majority end up being petty theft or shoplifting calls that we go to in the major commercial areas. Next slide, please. And this data is broken down by race and gender. And that's where we're at right now. And to be, I think we need to be a little more robust in how we talk about what's going on in some of these areas. But at this point, we need to build a little capacity in that area. Next slide, please. So next steps, a lot of what we talked about is going to change over the next couple months, if not sooner. Post has changes coming about. Get my notes. Post is moving towards grants for implicit bias, use of force and de-escalation, cultural diversity and awareness, community policing, wellness programs, and law enforcement officers. And Emeryville got involved and actually is involved in a grant right now by Post for wellness and those types of things. The legislative changes, some of those we've talked about, and I think there's someone that's going to be presenting some of the legislative changes coming about for police reform. I think one of the things that's directly impacting Emeryville is council's approval of the IA Pro project, which is a database that's going to start tracking, accommodations, your accidents, pursuits, use of force, complaints, personnel investigations, and getting in one centralized database. Also, some of the challenges with any data is labeling and categorizing, getting the categories down to where it's meaningful and that we understand what the categories mean. So a lot of that will help with the data analysis under the IA project as we move forward with that. And then I think as I'm here as the interim, I think one of the things that I need to get and make available, and we talked about it, and I think the mayor had it on his list, is an annual report. And the annual report has to have data related to use of force and data related to complaints and your data related to stops, arrests based on race and these kinds of things in order for the community, number one, to see what Emeryville's doing, Emeryville Police Department's doing, how they're doing it, and then to be able to make adjustments to that as well as council. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. So, oh, there we go. Who would like to start with questions? Vice Mayor Martinez?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Chief Schreeder, for the informative presentation. You actually answered 90% of my questions as we went along. But I would love, I'd love for you to elaborate on our internal body-worn camera policy. And I understand we have new body-worn cameras, and I just want to understand how they're turned on, when they're turned on, how long the information is kept for, the instances under which the footage is reviewed, and so forth. So if you wouldn't mind detailing that.
Well, the officers by policy are required to turn them on any enforcement stop, any evidentiary valued incident, almost pretty much any contact they have in the field that's the result of a call for service or an enforcement stop or anything like that. I do have some body-worn camera footage type information that I can share with you also. The way their work is they're on, and then the officer pushes the button and it turns it on during an enforcement stop or something like that as they're walking up to a car stop or they're walking up to an incident that they're being dispatched to. And once they're turned on, they're recording, and they should be recording the entire incident. At this point, I can only tell you that I've seen one use of force, or actually one complaint that came forward where the body-worn camera was not used, and it was actually a use of complaint, or I'm not sure, yeah, it was a use of force complaint. And it was from a couple of years back, so that data wasn't available to us. I think I'd have to refer to the city attorney on what the policy is for retention, but it should be built into our use of force policy, or not our use of force, but our camera policy. And generally, it's, from my perspective, it needs to be 2 years and a day at least. But like I said, I would refer to the city attorney, and this should be a citywide policy too, as far as retention goes. It falls under the same parameters. The data from the camera systems can be released if it falls under 1421. And that's where if an officer discharges his firearms at the end of the investigation, it's released to the public. And these kinds of incidents, they can be released. As a general rule, they're not released to the public, but it just depends. Can be released if it goes through the public process in court. For example, if it goes to court and it becomes public through court, certainly it can be released. There's no methodology now that I know of for us to put up stuff like that on the web page. But I know we have 1421 material that we do put out as Public Records Act request. I think where I would like to get to, and this is just me talking, is where you have a transparency portion to the police department's webpage, and things that are Public Records Act, we put on the transparency page because they're already in the public. Things that are 1421 related that require that we put it out. Our race stop information is out, or it'd be more of an annual report for that material. But that's where I come from. That's where I am more comfortable. It's a lot harder to make an argument as to why we're not putting something out than generally why we are putting something out. But the body-worn camera footage plays a huge dividend in training for officers. Because I'll give you an example. When you have an officer that's an allegation, let's say, of being rude to somebody in the public, which is a very common allegation when you talk about complaints. Not a common one, but when you look at all our complaints, 16 or so, it's one of the ones that comes up. And if the sergeant can sit down with a body-worn camera and go through the body-worn camera footage with the officer, they can sometimes say, if you had communicated this differently or that differently, the outcome may have been different. And when you have that video, to be able to have that kind of conversation makes a world of difference. It also makes a big difference when it comes to holding officers accountable. And it's not always perfect, so sometimes the body-worn camera footage plays a big part in that also. So accountability plays in there. And it also plays a big part in when it comes to resolving complaints at the lowest level. When you can watch the body worn camera footage, even call the person back and go, I'm not seeing what you see in the body worn camera footage. Can you tell me exactly what you're meaning when you made the complaint? And sometimes they struggle to articulate that too. And you can even look at it and go, the officer was very polite, very, articulate in their explanation of what was going on, things like that. So the body worn camera footage plays a huge dividend. And so like from January to June of this year, we uploaded about 6,500 videos, averaged about 31 a day. So almost every, call for service, things like that gets videoed. Average daily is about 4.5 hours of video is uploaded on a daily basis during that 6-month period. It's a lot of data. So the answer to the question on retention, I don't have that answer, but I can find it for you.
Thank you very much.
City Attorney, did you want to answer that, or you're not prepared? Not.
No, Mayor, I don't have that information immediately available, but between the chief and I, staff can send that to the council.
Great. Member Medina, Member Donahue was next, then I'll come to you. So, Member Donahue?
I would like to see of those use of force illustrations, for example, the amounts and the variety, what the arrest charges were that required that use of force, to have some connection to that. Is that data available?
It is. I think I mentioned that in the slide, that we don't have a crime analyst position in the department to be able to kind of pull all that information out. But I agree with you in some ways, analyzing how use of force is applied and to what it's applied to makes a difference. And, the classic one that, many members want to know about is when you go to mental health calls, how often is force used and these kinds of things. And it's fairly limited based on the number that we have, but, how do you get that? And how do you get there is really the analyst part of it. Can we do it? Sure. I have to figure out exactly what it would take and how much staff time it would take. But at this point, we have limited ability in that area.
Okay, thank you.
Member Medina?
Thank you so much for that presentation. I have a few questions. The first is, does our department have an explicit policy on hiring or rehiring officers with confirmed misconduct on their record?
I don't know that we have a policy on it. What I do know is that the chief of police determines what's acceptable for the organization and the organizational culture. When backgrounds are done, generally, each time a chief of police takes over an organization, that gets reset some degree. And what some chiefs will accept and others will can vary greatly. I can certainly tell you that, that there are some things that I will not accept that other agencies potentially would.
Thank you. The next question is there a way, I don't know if any other cities are making this public, to compare in the future, not right now, our non-post training hours and our use of force rates with other cities?
I talked to the city manager a little bit about that, and sometimes it's challenging because it's the definition that they use for use of force. And it comes up a lot with complaints. Some agencies do post their complaints and things like that, data, but it's how they define it, how they actually apply the definition, because, if the culture allows them not to necessarily apply the definition, that gets challenging too when collecting the data. From my perspective, you certainly could, but then you get into what's the population? How many calls for service did they go to? How many, and then trying to make the numbers kind of make sense. I think it's probably, from my perspective, a little better practice to really look at our community, the culture of the Emeryville Police Department, how we apply in practice what we do, and then look at the data sets that we have, because then I can tell you what the definition of a use of force is. I can tell you a definition of how we handle our complaints, and how every one of them, no matter how small, gets investigated and reviewed. And that's, even with that, the numbers are not as great as, to be honest with you, what I expected when I first got here.
Okay. Thank you. Another one is, I know you wrote out how many times mutual aid had been requested from us and how many times we responded. Is it possible to get data about how many times we have requested mutual aid and which agencies came to Emeryville?
Yeah, we requested mutual aid 6 times in the last couple months, and we didn't get any response for mutual aid for that. But when you look at what was going on during that period of time, it's not uncommon. Each agency is dealing with their own issues and then trying to expand that circle out. So I know there were other agencies in the city of Emeryville during that period of time. I don't know all the details on that, but if it was on the response. And Captain Collins is on the call, in whether or not he can add something to that. Maybe something we talk about on a later date or in the other areas.
Chief, we may be able to request that from ACSO as well. Mr. Mayor, we may be able to follow up on that with a request to the Sheriff's Office.
Okay, so
One more question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Sorry. And the CAD system, which I understand is kind of an antique system at this point, does it allow for API integration?
Does it allow for what?
An API integration, like if there was a way to de-identify data and take that out to do some of the sorting with kind of a third-party system, does it allow for an integration with other systems, basically?
I would say I don't know the answer to that question,
Okay.
can you remember? But based on what my experience so far with the CAD system is, I would probably say no, but I'd have to get that answer for you.
Okay. Thanks. I can probably figure it out with some Googling myself. Just was curious if you knew. Thank you so much. Oh, sorry, I had one more on here. The resisting arrest reasons for people being arrested in Emeryville, I saw that on there. Was that solely for resisting arrest?
It could be. It also could be part of another crime. So, for example, if you go to another call for service, it may be something that's tied to something else. It may not solely be for resisting arrest. To be honest with you, as an administrator, when I start seeing a lot of resisting arrests, I start questioning what's going on, and you start looking at that data to kind of go, why do we have that? What's changed? So it's generally called a 148 charge. It's resisting. Yeah. And to be honest with you, for me, that's one of those red flag kinds of cases. Does it occur? Yes, absolutely. Officers have to many times place people under arrest for resisting in order to get compliance and or provide services in a different way. But if you start seeing it, a lot of times, and this is where you're going to start seeing it with IA Pro project, because you'll actually see the sergeant has a dashboard with all the officers on it, and you can actually see some of these data points come up, so they can start looking at it as an early warning program.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Member Donnie, I'll come back to you in a moment. I wanted to give Member Bowders a chance, although I don't think he has any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have no questions at this time.
Okay. So, Member Donnie, you go ahead.
This is a sort of a question of overtime and the effects on our officers. I know that we have basically 3 shifts, and we have to have enough personnel to do 3 shifts. But some of our officers are doing overtime, say, for working for Apple at their store, or perhaps working other places. Is the amount of overtime delivering diminished service in our personnel? In other words, at what point does overtime become a negative for service for our citizens? And what can we, isn't there balance to be had where we just have to reduce police services, say, just to not have so much overtime that we're in effect getting reduced police services? This is more of a general question. What about that? And also, I am concerned about the injury rate of our officers and what our workers' comp rate is on our officers. I can imagine it's quite a bit lower for dispatchers than to patrol officers, but does our workers' comp rate seem normal to you for a department, or better than normal?
Well, I can't say that I've evaluated the workers' comp rate yet with HR. What I can say is when it comes to overtime, and I learned quickly when I first got here about Apple and Apple's contract. Contract overtime is not new or unusual to organizations. And even though we have it, ultimately, the primary assignment is providing services to the citizens, all the citizens of Emeryville, not just to Apple. If we can afford it, officers are allowed to sign up for it. And we do have policies in place limiting the number of hours that officers can work in a week and or in a day. But even that is challenging because sometimes when you look at some of that, it's, you may, for individuals, it may be too much. But ultimately, your goal is to have a healthy organization and have a staffing level that's such that there is some overtime, because the cost of an officer versus the cost of the overtime from a business standpoint balances out. But you want a staffing level high enough to where you don't necessarily have to depend on overtime to staff the organization for its primary function. And this all plays out with staffing, injuries, and these kinds of things, because if you have high injuries, you actually increase the amount of overtime. If you have high sick leave or these kinds of things, it plays out with wellness. So yeah, they're all kind of connected to some degree, and really kind of managing them as you move forward is the challenge of any police administration. So the answer to your question, it depends. At this point, what I can tell you is one of the questions I asked when I went around and started talking to employees of the police department, one of the questions I asked, what are the top 3 priorities? And almost universally, number 1 was staffing, because it has such a personal impact on the employees of the organization, either getting time off or being able to get the time they need to decompress, or having to cover shifts because somebody else is out. So staffing always becomes kind of a generalized kind of high priority theme for employees. And that's not new to Emeryville, that's universal. I mean, it seems like I've spent my entire administrative career dealing with staffing problems. But it is one of the challenges. And what's the balancing act? What's the right number? What's the right number to deliver the services that we want for the level of service that the citizens of Emeryville want, right? Because if staffing goes lower, sometimes you have to make decisions in that area that we are not going to provide a certain level of service. But I think one thing that I've noticed about Emeryville, we provide a very high level of service to this community. And it is one that, that I see as we're a very service-oriented department, very hands-on. We'll get almost any call we'll go to and try to resolve at some level. And in many ways, I like that because community members like that. But it's also a challenge because communities start to expect it. And when you can't provide it sometimes, that's when really the elected body starts hearing about it. And so we're always in that balancing state. So I know it's a long-winded way of trying to answer your question, but they're all interconnected, and trying to figure out what the right number is a challenge.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you.
I have a couple of questions, and I'll get to them in just a moment, just an organizational thing. So what I'm gonna do is ask my questions, take public comment, and then we'll share sort of the next step slide again to have a little bit of a discussion to see if I missed anything or if I put things on people don't want. And then we'll move into the legislation update. Don't know why I felt the need to update on process, but I did. So my first question, I wrote down 2 questions here. I'm going to tie them up together. So going back to earlier, the community talked to us a lot about the 8 can't wait or the 0 policies. And we did a good job of responding to that and sort of saying, look, our policies align with this. And so I want to thank whoever put that out. I think it was a combination of the department and the city manager. So I do want to say thank you for that. But then I'm going to ask the hard question. During your presentation, you made a comment, training makes a big difference. And I've been looking into that, and that's, it's an old refrain in education, as do having the right policies. But I couldn't find anything on effect size. And so my question is, do you have something to back that up? Something that says, yeah, this is what we see, a correlation between training and outcome?
Yeah, I think the question you're asking, is it evidence-based in the training that you're providing?
Right.
Yeah, and it is a challenge, to be honest with you. Sometimes the longitudinal study that's required to show that something is effective, and then what's the correlation between the two? That's some of the challenge. I don't think it's, so, when I started looking into whether or not some of the training is evidence-based, some of the grants by Post does talk about how to develop the correlation between, like, wellness, for example, and does it make an impact on use of force and or delivery of service. And I think even they're struggling a little bit with trying to figure out if some of the training is evidence-based as a whole. What I can tell you is it becomes, as you start looking at it, I think some of the use of force and or complaint type things, when you're talking about critical incident training and or critical communication plans or de-escalation, these kinds of things, you may be able to make some correlations between your complaints and use of force and those kinds of trainings, but I could not tell you that for sure at this point. In many ways, what we're trying to do is put a training plan that and develop a culture in an organization that's service-oriented and service-minded, and basically, in many ways, that we're trying to do the right thing for this community.
Yeah, I think you fed nicely into what I'll talk about in a little bit, that culture. And so I just want to put a pin in that for now, because I think that's a critical piece. The other question the next question I had is, you talked about, I'm going to call it the 40 millimeter weapon. You said you need authorization. We only have one person trained, and there's authorization from above. What is the level for authorization of its use? Where does that stop?
Well, in this department, it'd probably stop with me at the chief level, because you're talking about an operation plan. And in order to deploy something like that, you're deploying it for a specific purpose. And the 4 individuals that can deploy it at this point with the level of training needed, that would be an operation plan that I would have to sign off on.
Okay. So you were more definitive at the end, but you started with the probably. So let's pin that down.
Sorry. Yeah.
I'd like to pin that down or eliminate it from our arsenal, one or the other. Okay, I think I'll skip my question about the officer complaint and go to the public. I know somebody's had their hand raised since the dawn of time. So Sherry, do we have any comment cards or hands raised?
No comments at this time. We just have 2 raised hands. I will start with last 4 digits, 1281. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. First, I should ask the mayor, are you sure you want to let me speak? Because it seems in the past you've been trepidatious about that, and you've tended to the default position is to not let me speak. You might want to run it past the city attorney. I'll give you a moment to do that if you want to do that. Okay, you're not doing it, so I'm assuming it's fine to let me speak. Okay. I just heard something here that was disturbing from the interim chief. He said that contacts, either Terry stops and or vehicle stops, are not tracked by race. So I have had for months now a public records request to get the data, that exact data, and I have not heard anything from EPD about this. So shame on EPD. Why wouldn't the Emeryville Police Department tell me that they do not track by race, and that my public records request is not going to be honored because it's immaterial, or because it can't be done because of no contact, no tracking by race. So why wouldn't he? So that's my question to the interim chief, if he could respond to that. Why? I have a public records request. Why leave that hanging like that? Why wouldn't you have told me that information? It's been well over a month now. I've had this public records request that's been out there. And the next thing I want to know is, why don't we track by race? This department has shot and killed a black woman, Yvette Henderson. 4 shots fired. One hit the building with an AR-15 assault rifle wielded by Emeryville Police Department. One hit a building. One hit a parked car with a person in it. Another one hit the Yvette Henderson and got the gun that she was carrying was knocked out of her hand. And then the kill shot was when the police were in no danger because the gun was behind Yvette Henderson, and so the police officers were not in danger. And also the woman never pointed her weapon at the police, so there was no reason to kill. So, we never got to the bottom of that shooting in our recent history. And so why would a department that had that kind of a problem, in this case with a black woman, African-American woman, and then of course the previous chief putting up racist police blotter information on the city's website. So we have this bad issue with race at EPD. Why wouldn't the department track by race the contact, the Terry stops and the vehicle stops? And why didn't the council insist on this? I mean, it seems like this is information you don't want to know, frankly. So now the shame is on the city council. Why wouldn't you have asked long ago about this?
Hey,
I'd like to hear from the interim chief, please.
Okay. All right, Sherry, next speaker.
L. Perkins, unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hi. Yes. I'm just going back to the comment that was made about, I think it was the question that Member Medina had about the policy on hiring officers with confirmed misconduct histories. And it seems to me that should definitely be something that gets created, that a policy would be created for the city to have some mechanism to check who they're hiring and know what that policy, and that the community would know what that policy looks like too. That's all.
Thank you for that comment. And I did put that on our tracking sheet, so thank you. Next speaker, please.
Sophia Cordova, unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hi. First, I just quickly want to say that I appreciate the time and space given by the council for this conversation. And I especially appreciate the acknowledgement by the mayor about the discomfort that is an invaluable and crucial part of the long work of dismantling racism and of delving into how the police serves to uphold that ideology. I do feel like opening with a police info set, the deck that you shared does set the tone. I understand that this is a study session and we're here to review data, but it does feel a little bit like a preemptive defense. And I wish that we had, if not begun elsewhere, just begun in a way that talks about other options and what we're looking at here. Anyway, the stats presented were seen to be better than most in the country, but I want to remind everyone here that we are in a context. Emeryville borders Berkeley and Oakland, and our borders are particularly volatile. There's a lot of houseless folks in those areas, and I feel like a lot of the time, Emeryville police moves houseless people off our bounds. And I think that true reform requires responsibility to our citizenry. So I do feel like, yeah, well, maybe the stats are good here, but what happens when these folks get moved down to other police departments who may not have such glowing response rates, et cetera, et cetera. Read the slide and information about mutual aid. Go with me here for a minute. I feel like the use of that term in a policing context is really harmful in a way to what those concepts really mean. And I want to invite the council to really expand the meaning of what mutual aid means within the context of community safety. Let's fund the creation and support of options that are bigger and better for our community. Let's finance social workers, for example, who can respond appropriately to situations when they are needed. And what isn't needed is a person with a gun that has a sort of menacing quality about them. I think allocating funds for true mutual aid is a really important step in what we're discussing here. I also appreciate the conversation that happened around the use of force data, but to me, these conversations kind of get boggled down in minutia. And what we need to address is the umbrella subjective system that allows and cites and reviews those, right? So if it's a system that is in charge of reviewing and charging people for use of force, and it's a system that's not asking deeper questions about that, the allowance to use of force on a citizenry to begin with, I do feel like we have bigger problems. To close, as we know, the police all over the country are out of control and overfunded. This is particularly gruesome when our kids are receiving subpar education, and poverty is a threat at many doors, especially currently with the COVID shutdown. My personal ideal would be to get away from policing altogether and generate modes that respond in concert with other services that are holistic and about citizen care. But I know that that is probably not going to happen in the imminent future. I just ask that the police here in Emeryville is defunded to whatever funds are necessary, at least 50%, to fund the schools and reinvent education in our town. Emeryville, I think, has gone beyond and setting the record for the nation in many things like labor. And I think this is a great opportunity to break the school to prison pipeline so prevalent in this country, and to help, above all right now, supply the needs of our houseless communities and those on the verge of such precarity. And yeah, I know I probably went over, but thanks.
Thank you. I think that was quite helpful to the conversation. And so I'll bring it back around for member discussion. And Sherry, if while we're doing that, would you bring up the priority list?
Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
Christine, would you like Nicolo to quickly go through the pending legislation before you do that, or after you have this discussion?
You know, I think this will be relatively brief. I just want to share what I've captured and get some additional information from my colleagues, and then we can move on to Nicolo. So again, I think looking at this, and forgive me, I've ordered it in priority. And so things I've added is the annual reporting. I think that's really important, and I think that should come out of the Public Safety Department. The impact on overtime, again, I think it's a good conversation for public safety to have, putting it off maybe till November. But I do want to, I did capture the body cam data, and then finally the hiring policy on transferring of officers. And I guess I'm not seeing a lot of hands raised, so I'm going to comment on what I was saying earlier about culture. Culture really sets the tone and has the biggest impact on any department, and that is set from the chief as we're in the process. And so I want to thank Chief Schrader for stepping in for us, knowing that he's stepping in at a challenging time. But as we go through the hiring process, it's a blur to me. I think about 10 days ago or a week ago, Member Martinez and I were talking to our recruiter who's going to be reaching out to the community. Even if we find the right chief, who's an amazing chief, I think something as important as hiring policy. I called it transfer officers because that's how I framed it in my mind. But this is somebody who might have been let go from another department or had complaints at another department. Did I capture what you were going at, Member Medina? I'm seeing you nod.
Yes, or even rehiring within a department.
Yeah, so I just think that would be something that would be, I don't want it to be nebulous. And so, Chief, I'm going to sort of say, because I hear you when you say there's some chief's discretion, and as a hiring manager myself, I like that discretion because I think we look at the whole person. But this is one of those things where I don't want it to be nebulous. I want some very clear guidance for the chief in hiring decisions on officers who've got a track record. Anything I missed during those conversations or anything you guys have thought of? Member Medina, go ahead.
Yeah, I think establishing a forum of annual reporting is great. I think we might want quarterly or at least twice a year reporting to the Public Safety Committee and getting an email sent to all council members. And I know that BPAC and at Transportation Committee, we have frequently asked for data on stops and collisions and had a lot of trouble getting that information. So I would maybe even want to separate out like a transportation related data collection. And I'm happy to work with the department and try to look at like what new technology is out there that could interact with the CAD system for getting that kind of demographically accessible data to us as quickly as possible, since we are moving towards an actual legislative timeline with that in 2022. I'd also like to add that I think for AB 953, we should have a council update item on how the department plans to implement that ahead of schedule.
Can you say that number one more time for me?
Assembly Bill 953, which is going to require us to be doing all this reporting on demographic data that we're not currently able to.
Okay.
And yeah, can we do one on transportation and traffic related data?
Mr. Mayor, could I jump in and ask a clarifying question?
Please do.
So with regard to the agenda, you have an item 6.2, which listed the topics that council members had identified. And I just want to clarify whether you will also have this discussion when you get to item 6.2 as well.
We will. We'll come back around to it. So I don't want to walk out of here without a list of things to do. And so we're going to generate it probably 2 or 3 more times.
Okay. So you'll have this discussion about topics for the work plan on item 6.2 when you get to that. Thank you.
Okay, I'm scrolling down to see if Member Bitters had a question. I don't see his hand, but Member Donahue, you're up. And you're on mute.
I would like us to consider things we could take off the police department's plate to perhaps generate less overtime, but also so that they wouldn't be doing servicing as much. We have other departments in our city that are open 8 hours a day, and certain kinds of calls that come into the dispatcher might be directed elsewhere, and our police wouldn't be overburdened with so much. And, one of the things I could think of is just the other day, this occurred from a neighbor who was complaining about a commercial business making noise between 7 and 10 p.m. I think that person talked to me, the right person, a council member. I think council members should receive calls about noise complaints between 7 and 10 p.m. at night, partly because if it's coming from a commercial business, not from neighbors, inevitably the council is going to have to be concerned with that. It's like we have certain standards in our city, and there's something I think that we could take off the plate of the police, just, looking at it that way. But there are many other possibilities for reducing the workload for our police.
Yeah, I have similar beliefs when we talk about this as to who interacts. I didn't think of it in terms of noise complaints, but I did think of it in terms of interacting with people having mental health challenges or other what are generally called quality of life concerns. Where were you envisioning this conversation happening?
In future discussions, probably at the public safety level.
Okay.
Safety committee.
Perfect. All right. And again, I cannot see everybody, so let me scroll down and see if Vice Mayor Martinez or Member Bowders. Vice Mayor Martinez, go ahead.
Thank you. I was wondering, Chief Streeter, if you'd be able to respond to the public comment regarding the moving of unhoused people from public property and our policy.
Well, I don't have a lot of information on that at this point. I can certainly take a look and get back to the council on that. Certainly, I would imagine our policy is that we don't do that.
It has been in the past, so I'm just wondering if anything has changed.
Yeah, I would say both. Like I said, I'll check in with here and get back to the council on that. But I would imagine that our policy is that we don't do that. And it's for a variety of reasons, both legal and otherwise.
That was my understanding. I would love to update the public. Thank you.
Great. All right. Member Bowders, I looked away. You're good? All right. Then I'll hand it back to the city manager to bring us to our next presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. One of the, so this is moving to your item 6.2. As part of putting this study session together, the council at future scheduling and also at 2 sessions of the Public Safety Committee had identified a number of items that you wanted to discuss or ask questions about. One of those was a review of pending legislation as it relates to police reform. And so we have Nicolo DeLuca from Townsend Public Affairs, who will walk you through the list that was published with the agenda and the status of those pieces of legislation. And then there were a number, 6 or 7 other topics that we included for discussion. The chief was able to touch on some of them, but those are on your agenda. But for now, what I'd like to do is turn it over to Mr. DeLuca, who can walk you through the list of pending police reform legislation. Nicolo?
Thank you very much. And Honorable Mayor, council members, and city manager, appreciate being included in this discussion. The chief touched upon some of it. I will give a review and an update as to where we are legislatively. I would also, by Friday, I'm going to update the list of pending legislation due to COVID, due to the time it takes to amend some bills. I want to add 1 bill to the list and then remove another. The one we're removing is SB 773 from Senator Skinner. We touched base with her office and they're not moving that bill forward this year. So where we stand in Sacramento, the return to recess has been delayed. So it's scheduled for this upcoming Monday, the 27th. Keep in mind, due to the state constitution, the legislative session needs to end by August 31st of this year. So essentially we have about 700 bills to be heard over about a 4-week period. So we will obviously be sending updates. They might be on Saturdays and Sundays due to when the various committees will be meeting, but it's a compressed schedule. When the year started, after COVID, bills were pared down to only be COVID related or housing. And obviously after some of the protests from George Floyd and other issues, there's been more police reform bills this year. And so I will highlight a few of them. Like I said, I will update the list that we provided, and we'll be providing the city content updates when these bills will be heard. So again, keeping in mind, the session starts on Monday. We'll have about a little over 4 weeks to address all these bills. The bills that I really want to touch upon, which the police chief has somewhat mentioned, is going to be 4 main ones. The first one is Senate Bill 731 from Senator Stephen Bradford. That is being referred to as the decertification bill. So essentially, if a police officer was fired in the city of Emeryville, that officer could not be hired in another city. I think the chief alluded to some cities currently have that practice, others don't. So this bill would be to make it statewide. Sounds like along the discussions that you all have been having, my recommendation would be this is a good bill to formally support. Another bill is when it comes to, it's along the topics of defunding the police, is Assembly Bill 2054 from Assemblywoman Kamlager. Essentially what that bill does is it creates a 3-year pilot program for funding for kind of non-sworn actions. So there's been a lot of discussion about not having a sworn officer respond to certain calls or interact with, say, maybe the mentally ill. AB 2054 would create a pilot program for 3 years where there'd be funding to help fund some of those activities. Again,
Niccolo,
kind of keeping
excuse
along
me.
the lines. Yes.
I'm sorry, this is Sherry. Apparently, some folks are having trouble seeing this, so I'm going to try to reshare it if you just want to take a pause for a moment.
Absolutely.
And somebody say something when you can see it.
Well, it was there for a moment. It's gone now.
How about now?
There you go.
It's there. We're good.
Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay.
You're getting lots of thumbs ups.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
No problem. What I'll do is, to be helpful, I'll take it from the top. And I'm not going to talk about every bill. I'm just going to highlight a few that are on this list. The second from the top, AB 1196 from Assemblymember Mike Gibson. That's to ban certain chokeholds. There's been a lot of support for that bill. It's going to be moving forward without knowing the exact process of EPD. That sounds like something that the city has not already implemented would be something to support. Moving a couple more bills down is the bill I was talking about, AB 2054 from Assemblymember Kamlager. What that does is it establishes a 3-year grant pilot program. The goal of that is to expand the participation of community organizations in emergency response for vulnerable populations. So that would be where you'd get your funding to have non-sworn respond to certain calls for service. Moving a little bit further down the list, on the next page is Senate Bill 731 from Senator Bradford. That is the decertification bill that I was mentioning. The bill below that, SB 773, is being removed. Senator Skinner is not moving it this year. And then moving a little bit further down, the very last one is Senate Bill 776, which is also from Senator Skinner. What this would do, I want to highlight that the chief mentioned 1421. That's a reference to Senate Bill 1421 from Senator Skinner a couple of years ago, which allowed certain records to be accessible by the Public Records Act, specifically records to police reports, investigations, certain findings, certain incidences involving a discharge of a firearm, instances involving strikes of impact or projectiles, what have you. So SB 776 from Senator Skinner is almost an expansion of SB 1421, which what it would do would make other incidents involving use of force subject to disclosure. The bill would require that records relating to sustained findings of wrongful arrests or wrongful searches to be subject of disclosure and other similar issues. So we've got these bills. Like I mentioned before, I will update the list because I want to add one and remove another one. We're watching these very, very closely. At the desire of the mayor and the council, let me know if you want for me to keep watching or take formal positions. Other than that, that is everything that is laid out in front of me to talk about. Happy to take each and every question you all may have.
Thank you for that. I will take questions. Seeing none. Oh, Member Donahue. Got it under the wire.
What's the likelihood of some of these, I guess, 4 bills you mentioned passing in your guesstimates? I recognize that, with 700 bills being considered in 1 month, is it unlikely that these 4 bills are going to pass from your experience point of view, or there's a strong chance they will?
Councilmember, that's a great question. And I specifically highlighted those 4 because in my personal opinion, I see those 4 have the best chance of making it through to the governor. Granted, amendments are likely and the desire is strong, whether it's from the Black Caucus or some of the Senate Dems or others, to really get a good, strong push behind those bills. But those 4 I highlighted specifically because I feel, in my professional opinion, they have the best chance to get to the governor. Keep in mind there would be some amendments.
Thank you very much.
Okay. All right, without further questions or clarifications, we'll go to public comment. Sherry?
There are no online speaker cards, and I don't see any raised hands. Give people a moment. Oh, there's one. Hang on. Last 4 digits, 1281. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to get the name of the gentleman that is making the presentation, because I'm sorry I missed it, and it's not on the agenda that I can see. Because if somebody could just volunteer, break in right now and give me the name of the gentleman, I would appreciate it. Is that possible? Just Sherry Hartz. What is the name of the gentleman that just made the presentation?
Nicolo De Luca.
Nicolo. Okay. Nicolo, I would draw to your attention, if you're watching online, if you can see the reaction from the council members. Note that the mayor is now blacked out his camera. And the reason why he's done that is because I'm sometimes critical of the city council and critical of the mayor's policies. And the mayor has a hard time countenancing critics, people that are critical of his job performance. And so just so you know, Nicolo, this is the kind of city that you're dealing with here. It's one where the mayor blacks out his image when people are speaking that are critical of city council policies. And it's basically, Emeryville's a podunk town. I mean, that kind of behavior is considered acceptable here. I just thought you should know that in your dealings with the city of Emeryville. Thank you very much.
Okay, any other public comments?
I don't see any.
All right. Discussion on this. Member Medina.
Yeah, I think if we can get support letters out for these bills, I don't know, Nico, if any of them have been set for next week.
As of right now, the Senator Bradford Bill 731 and the Senator Skinner Bill 776 have not yet been set. However, they did announce committee hearings yesterday, so they should be set in the next day or 2.
Okay. I think maybe I would suggest that if we want to go through the list, if we all support all of these bills, maybe if they get set for committee hearings, sending support letters for them.
Yes, I support that. Is everybody else in support? Do we want to go through the whole list, or how would you like to proceed? Nicola, that was kind of for you.
Oh, absolutely. You know what I'll do is I'm going to call up. Well, I think it makes sense to go through all of them and say yes or no in support. I do want to add one bill, and sorry, Sherry, if it screws it up. The chief did allude to Assembly Bill 1022 from Assemblymember Holden. The only problem, or when we submitted the legislative list, the bill had not yet been amended. It was just amended late last week. So that's another bill I would like to put out there that I think is worthwhile of supporting, and the chief did highlight that in his PowerPoint. So what I can do is just go through, mention each bill, and you all just say yay or nay.
If I could,
starting from.
If I could just jump in.
Yeah.
This is a study session, and so none of this is agendized for action. So
Right.
The request was to give you an overview of the legislation. And that's really what the purpose of this is for information. Sorry, Nicolo.
Oh, all good.
We do have, the mayor does often sign letters of support for pieces of legislation that are consistent with your overall priorities. That is something that we have done in the past in between council meetings, so we can certainly talk I can talk to him about that offline, but in terms of the council action, this is really an information item, not an action item.
Okay. Member Bowders, I think that was going to be what you were going to say, but I want to come back to just in case.
That was my comment. This is a study session, and we have not authorized ourselves to take action, nor are all the bills that were being proposed for action to be taken listed, so we shouldn't be doing that.
So, okay. Any other comments or questions on this section? Because if not, I want to go back to our next steps, because I feel like, again, as I opened with, I was concerned that we weren't going to cover all the things that we had hoped to cover during this session. You know, we had asked, sorry, I'm looking at our list.
You want me to share that again, Mayor?
That's a different list than what I'm looking at. I'm looking
sorry.
at what originally we populated from our meeting. So bear with me here. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of things that we just did not get to today. And so let's go ahead and share my list again. And I will go through these items and then talk about things that I think that are missing so we can set up future agenda items. And so I want to make sure that we have covered everything, because again, I feel like we drifted a bit, and bear with me as I'm dealing with multiple screens here. So, all right, so I'm going to give people a moment to look at this. And sorry, I'm doing two things at once, not my strength. All right, so I added letters of support, but I want to come back around. So the first thing that we didn't really address at all today was the first thing on here, the most important, which is the updates and misdemeanors in our municipal code. And we had talked about that as being something that we would address at this meeting. And I don't think we have, and it's something that's going to have to come back to council. So I'm going to look to staff now. I think this is something we should bring to the first meeting in September. And I think Mr. Bowders has a list. Am I accurate on that, Mr. Bowders?
I have done a review of the city code, but I understand that the staff, when I raised this at the council meeting, Mr. Mayor, the staff had said they needed time and to do research. I don't know how much time that was. I would amend this item's description slightly to say, instead of saying update misdemeanors, I would actually say decriminalize the municipal code. That's the function I would like us to discuss. I think that's probably going to require a conversation about what that entails, both eliminating misdemeanors because it's duplicitous of state law in most cases, but also the use of infractions versus administrative citations and having a conversation about what that looks like. And so I would like to have that conversation. I recognize that today is not the appropriate time to do that and staff need time, but I would defer to staff on when they'll be ready to do that.
So I'm going to come back to the city manager and say, is that something we can have when we come back from our recess?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, as we indicated on the report, how we reflected it was revising the Emeryville Municipal Code to change misdemeanors to lesser offenses. And so that is what we would be looking at. It would be unlikely to come back on September 1st, just given city attorney staffing. But we can certainly endeavor to do our best for the September 15th meeting. I haven't had a chance to confirm that with Mr. Bina, but I definitely agree with Councilmember Bowders that we need to have a conversation about what the level of offense is, because there's a big difference between an infraction and an administrative citation. And I think you may wish to move in the latter category as much as possible.
Great. So let's bring that back on the 15th so that we can really have that conversation, and be sure to allocate enough time in the agenda for that. Okay. The other thing that I thought was a great suggestion, and I know is a little bit beyond the scope of the council's authority, is booking photos. And again, this is something Member Bowders brought up, but again, we have not addressed it. City Manager, if you want to quickly repeat what you'd said to me earlier, then we can talk about agendizing it. So go ahead.
We can also bring an information report on that, Mr. Mayor. It's my understanding the city of Emeryville does not publish booking photos. Those booking photos are maintained by the Alameda County Sheriff's Office. However, it's also my understanding that they are subject to release by way of a Public Records Act request. However, with that said, that's very different responding to a Public Records Act request versus proactively publishing something. And I think it is the proactively publishing that you would wish to avoid. As I said, my understanding is the city of Emeryville does not do that because it does not control those booking photos, but we could certainly present that in an information item for the council to discuss if you would like to have the department adopt a formal policy.
So I think that was the initial request. And I think I would also like to make sure that we capture that completely. So be sure you agendize it twofold. One, our I'll call it internal policy. And then I think, not that we have much impact on the county level, but also then lobbying at the county level to sort of encourage that practice from the Alameda County Sheriff, who does control those booking photos. Member Bowders, I want to make sure that I'm on the same page you are here. Are you supportive of those? And I'll look for everybody else on council as well.
That's the accurate reflection of what I requested. There's one item I had, Mr. Mayor, that's not appearing on your list that I'd like to address as well.
We'll get to that at the very, we've got till 5 o'clock at least, and I plan to make sure that we cover everything. Because again, I want to make sure, because there's a lot of stuff that I want to talk about that I don't feel we have gotten to. So, all right, is everybody else in support of that? I'm just want to make sure that everybody's in agreement. I'm not seeing yeses or nos. I see one other thumb. That gives us 3, so I'm good. All right, coming back to this next one. We talked about this already, alternatives to sworn officers, and I just want to make a comment here before I let in, if anybody else wants to talk first, feel free to wave at me. Otherwise, I have a comment here. Scott, I really like where you're thinking about this. If people remember just over a year ago, or just under a year ago, when we were looking at increasing our funding, which has now taken a big shift because of the current situation, I talked about not adding more sworn officers, but really bringing in a full-time social worker. I'm going to continue pushing for that because I think when we talk about interactions with the public, there are certain things that have to be done by sworn officers, but there's a lot of what our police officers do that can be done differently and by people who have a different approach, different training, and lead to hopefully better outcomes for both our sworn officers and for the people they're interacting with. So I'm going to keep pushing that. I think funding is going to be a big issue here for whatever we want to do going forward, given the budget realities. But I think that's a good conversation for public safety, although I'm willing to bring it back around to, I think we start the conversation there, and whatever we end up with making a recommendation, it'll definitely have to come back to the whole council. So I want to make sure that people understand my thinking on this. It blends in with what Member Donahue was talking about and with that approach. So how do people feel about this? I see Scott's in agreement. I see Allie, you have a comment? You're on mute.
Rookie move. I would just like to add that if we're considering alternatives, we also start to look at traffic enforcement alternatives specifically for non-moving vehicle violations. And I don't know if we could make that as a separate thing that goes to Transportation Committee, but I think that's an important conversation to start having.
Yeah, I think parking and so non-moving violations. I want to make sure I'm understanding that correctly. Non-moving to me is parking enforcement, or are you talking more broadly?
Kind of broadly among what kind of traffic enforcement could potentially be done by non-sworn officers. And I think a good place to start is looking at using parking enforcement for, I think we saw a slide earlier that broke down how many of our violations were moving vehicular violations versus non-moving. It seems like non-moving might be in a much easier place to start.
And I think for me, I hear you wanting to have some of that in the Transportation Committee. I still think that's something that should come out of public safety. I'm going to look to the city manager here. Is it possible when we get to that point to do just a joint meeting between the two?
Well, that would essentially be the full council because that would be 4 of you. So you
Sure.
might just meet as a committee of the whole on some of these things.
All right. So how about, again, it's going to start in public safety. And I think there's some questions as to, I know Berkeley and Member Donahue shared this with me, that Berkeley's trying some very innovative things. I think there are some challenges with what a person can and cannot do, and at what point a person is acting as a police officer. So I'd like to have that conversation in public safety and then bring it to the whole council. So is everybody else in support of this thought? Perfect. All right. Establishing annual quarterly reporting. I want to really keep that in public safety because I want the chief to really expand what is possible. And I think that's something we can start talking about as soon as October. And so is everybody okay with that, or is that something a little bit more urgently? But we'll pick some times on the calendar that can happen out. Member Donahue, this is really just for you, the impact of overtime, something we can bring back to the Public Safety Committee in November. I don't know if the whole council is interested in that, but I just felt like that's something that I'd put on here because it's a public safety comment. All right, staff, you're on for retention of body cam data and get that to us by September. We're sort of looking at the city attorney on that. Is that plenty of time?
That's a simple answer, Mr. Mayor. We can just give you that answer.
I just wanted to make sure I captured it on my list. Okay, hiring policy on transfer officers. And so, Member Medina, I don't want to keep turfing everything to public safety, but that seems like a natural fit for this. Let the chief draft a policy, and then
I can't even come up with a bullshit nexus to transportation for that, for sure.
Yeah, well, in the transfer, they would have to actually commute to get there, so we can go with that. All right, bear with me here. Helps if the shift key doesn't move. And so we'll go from there. My kryptonite is typing and talking at the same time, if you weren't aware. All right, I think when we have a reasonable time for an update on 953, bring that back to the whole, oh, that's why I couldn't do it. Bring it back to the whole council. My whole system has fallen apart. The next thing is traffic data reporting. Happy to have the chief come and talk to you guys about that at Transportation Committee. Does that seem like everybody's in support of that?
For clarification purposes, Mr. Mayor, is that the stop data that you're asking for, or what kind of data?
Member Medina was asking for something different. I'll let her address that.
Yes, I think stop data, and what has also been requested by Transportation and CPAC multiple times, is any collision data.
Collision data, yes, definitely. So if that's what traffic data means, it's collision data, well, we can.
Stop, I want both of those things.
Yeah.
Right, and just to reflect back, we're not collecting stop data yet.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be a later.
I discussed about how we could start doing so.
Right, and that's actually just, it's related to 953 since we need to develop an approach to that, and we probably will, Mr. Mayor, we'll probably be bringing that back to the full council because my guess is that we will need a resource allocation of some sort to be able to fulfill that obligation.
Great. Okay. All right. Thank you for indulging me as we went through all of that. Member Bowders, you seem to have something you wanted to add, so I'm going to come to you first, and then we'll go to anybody else.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've wanted to have regulation of chemical, kinetic, and diversionary devices. I had requested and received majority council support for that at a prior meeting, and it's in the list in the staff report. Yep,
no, it's on my list as well. And when I saw that they were going to talk about chemical weapons, I thought we were going to get into it there. So I think that's a big full council discussion item. I think that's something we're all going to want to weigh in on. I don't see any reason to put it down to public safety. And so, city manager, I'm going to look to you to see when you think we can start talking about that.
That's really up to the council. I think Councilmember Bowders probably has a proposal. If there's a request for research or information, what we were trying to do today was give you a sense of what we have and how we use it and what the training is that's required for it. If there is more information that the council needs about uses of force with these less lethal devices in order to inform that policy discussion, we're happy to look into that and bring that back to you.
And Mr. Mayor, to her comment, I do have a proposal. I have been working with several other local elected officials, not just here in California, about best practices on how to handle crowd control without using certain types of devices and without going into detail. Some of the things that are authorized, the police chief spoke to for use in the city of Emeryville are actually prohibited for use in warfare under both the Geneva Protocol of 1925 as well as the Chemical Weapons Convention. And so I would like the topics of chemical, kinetic, and diversionary devices to be discussed. I don't know that there is additional research required, but if it would suit the council and these other items that have been listed as high priority, if we were to move through those first, I don't think this item is as urgent. It could be put on on an October or November agenda for discussion and potential further direction or action if it suits the council. But I would like to have that conversation. I agree with you. It should be by the whole committee.
Perfect. I'm putting it down for November. Feel free to bring it in October. But let's start having those conversations. And this way, if we haven't hit it by November, we will definitely do it then. Vice Mayor Martinez, you have your hand raised. Member Bowders, I don't know if you have other items, but let me come to her and come back to you. So Vice Mayor Martinez.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is not an action item, but I just wanted to check in with the city manager. For those in the public who don't know, we're in the process of recruiting a new chief of police. And I understand that there's going to be a public part of this process, and I just wanted to check in with our city manager to see if there are any details or timelines on what that might be.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. I do not have an answer for you. We've started that process, as you know, just recently. We hired the recruiter, and I think last week he interviewed council members to start the process of thinking what is the ideal candidate for Emeryville. He was out of town this week, so we will be putting together the next steps in that process when he gets back. And so I don't have a good answer for you, but timeline-wise, I can tell you the end, which is we need to have a candidate selected by December, because that is when Chief Schreeder will can't be with us anymore. So that we have an end cap on that. So we are moving with that in mind.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that. Okay, anybody else before I go back? Did we miss anything? I'm sort of looking at Member Medina and Member Donahue now before I scroll back up to see. Okay. I had two things that I wanted to sort of gauge council temperature on and maybe bring back as separate items in the future. But in response to a lot of this, what our neighbor cities are doing are having deeper conversations on race in general, whether they're setting up task forces. You know, Oakland has an entire office dedicated to it. Is this a discussion that, given all that we have going on, something we want to start having on a semi-regular basis, something we can bring back? And I'm sort of just throwing that out there, and I don't want to get too far down the rabbit hole. I see the city attorney furrowing his brow. So, but I just want to make sure that that is said out loud, and that it is something we can bring back and really sort of start having some conversations in public with the community on race, because that was, to me, implied in what we wanted to talk about today, but really not explicit. And so I want to be very explicit that that's not only the intersection of policing, but, you know, we're seeing in the impact in healthcare, we're seeing in the impact of housing. You know, it's difficult for me as an old white guy to simply say, oh, I think Emeryville does a great job, because I think that's not the right way to approach this. So I'm throwing that out there to my colleagues, and seeing if that is something you guys want to think about, talk about as we head into our month-long recess. And silence. Okay. Member Martinez.
I think this might be a good conversation to have after we have our new chief in place. As I mentioned before, I'm interested in having a community participation in selecting our new chief. And you and I, Mr. Mayor, have given input on what we think that person should be and what their sensitivities should be. And I'll just lay it out for the public that we're very interested in making sure that implicit bias and is addressed. You know, we already have certain training that we're happy that we have, but I think this is a conversation that we don't necessarily need to be in a rush with. You know, we're not the biggest community in the East Bay, and certainly we need to see ourselves in a greater context. And I think it'll be helpful to have that new person seated and have them be part of the conversation.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I might bring that back around and yeah, go ahead, Member Medina or Member Medina, were you raising your hand?
I just think, like, you know, if we're going to continue to have these conversations, we should make sure that we're leaning on the expertise within our community and within nonprofit groups that have done a lot of research on this. You know, I've been speaking extensively with Just Cities about the Fair Chance Housing Ordinance, which really gets into the nexus of criminal justice reform and housing. And I think bringing those people to the table to have a more robust conversation would probably be helpful, and maybe a little bit more challenging for us, frankly, but worth it.
Okay, thank you. That's kind of where I was headed with this. Member Bowders?
Yeah, I want to just agree with both Vice Mayor Martinez and Councilmember Medina and add that I think that holding this meeting today, Mr. Mayor, was a great thing, in having this agenda and the police department reporting on this and the council members all contributing ideas. You know, the one thing I don't want to lose sight of, and I know that's the intent of everyone here, is to be really an equitable process. The community, I think, needs to be more of a participant in this. And so I think really working with the folks who do this, I mean, I work with criminal justice reform organizations for a living and community-based, you know, restorative justice organizations. I just feel like, to your inquiry about having a race conversation, I think, yes, I'm supportive of that. I think the timing of that with new staff coming on, I think is critical. And I would just really strongly endorse that we do not lead that, but that we sit as participants in it, and we have that run and facilitated by people who do this work every day. I just think that that's super important to doing this correctly. So I don't doubt that you agree with me, Mr. Mayor, and I think I'm just adding on to what you're probably going to say, but I just wanted to frame that with the other comments I heard that I agree with.
Yeah, no, again, to me, I think that I will go back to what I opened with of, this is a conversation I want to make sure I'm not in the way of, as opposed to, and so by not saying, hey, let's do this, or not saying, hey, should we do this? I want to make sure I'm asking the right question. I have no interest in leading the conversation because I know I am the wrong person to do that. But I think I have a lot of faith in our city manager and my colleagues to make sure that we find the right members of the community to come in and to make sure that we are on it. And I'm hearing this is something that we're looking at maybe to start the new year and leave on the plate of the future mayor and or things. But so city manager, were you able to follow that and get a sense of, you know, put this on your, 300 deep item of to-dos to sort of start helping me as I wrap up my term, set this up for the next council?
Absolutely. There's a number of different models about how to engage. And certainly we have some really excellent community partners who can take a leadership role in helping guide us through that. I think there's also some things we'll be doing at the staff level with organizations who work with public sector staff particularly. So I think there'll be some mutual interest in moving the conversation along.
All right. And so this last one, and forgive me, this is me thinking out loud, having an idea that is larger than I am, and you can make your size jokes there. One of the things that has struck me during all of these conversations is citizen oversight of police. And I've been listening to Mayor Aragon talk about what he's doing. I've talked to Mayor Schaaf about what it looks like in Oakland and the things they have in place. And one of the things that kept coming back to me is we are such a small town that any citizen oversight is going to be challenging, because we all know very well our police department. If you're an active member of our community, you know most of the police officers on a first name basis. You know, a third of our or a quarter of our population lives across the street from the police department and is quite interactive with them. And so I thought it presents certain challenges. Plus there's the logistics and the costs and all sorts of things that we as a small town struggle with. And so I didn't want to go down this rabbit hole, which is not my area of expertise, without checking with my colleagues first. One of the things that came to my mind, and this is the big idea, is this a conversation we want to start thinking about as a regionalized citizen oversight committee for the greater area, so that we are able to deal with, I think we talked about mutual aid earlier. And so I really just going to throw that out there because this is a much larger, longer term conversation. And I'm happy for you guys to say, no, let's stay in our small city role. But the idea would be that we would join forces, maybe not with Oakland, which is too large, but with a lot of our other communities in either the North County, the entire county, and have one citizen oversight committee that helps us in the rare occasion that we have those bigger issues in town. So I'm going to end there and get a sense of what's going on. And I see several puzzled faces sort of thinking how that would work. And but I was trying to think of what it would look like. And I've had some great conversations with people about how valuable citizen oversight is. And I've had several thoughts of how challenging it would be in Emeryville. So, Councilmember Medina.
My first thought is that if we are partnering with smaller cities and not the cities on either side of us because they're already large and have their own established ones, we are not getting a citizen oversight body. We're getting a Piedmont and Albany oversight body to Emeryville, which has much more demographically in common with Oakland and Berkeley. And that would be a major concern for me, just at first blush.
Yeah, I mean, okay. They were not the two communities I was thinking of, but yes.
I don't know which ones you were thinking of, but just,
yeah,
the other small cities.
Yeah, and Berkeley is still just establishing theirs, if I'm not mistaken, or is it up and running now?
Mr. Mayor, the Police Review Commission in Berkeley is actually one of the oldest in the country. It was established in 1973.
Right.
So they are, I think, looking at revising it to something that looks more like the extremely robust police commission that the city of Oakland has.
Right.
So I think they're in a process to consider a different approach, but they do have a police review commission that's been there for a while.
I'm sorry, I misspoke. Yes, I was aware of that, but it's that remodeling that I was thinking of. So, and again, I'm looking to you guys. You're the big thinkers, I know. And so, and I'm okay walking away without an answer.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Well, we were talking to the police about what's the evidence behind your training. I think if we're going to talk about citizen oversight boards, those are one of those things that sounds really intuitively great. What is the evidence of the efficacy of them? And I would want to have that discussion before we allocate resources towards such things.
And there is some evidence to support it, but I'm Chief Schrader. I don't know if you're prepared to have any thoughts on that, but I think that's a great conversation starter, Member Medina.
And Mr. Mayor, if I could just deposit one thought for consideration, which is also the notion of an auditor.
Right.
Bring in a police auditor, which some agencies have experience with. And that may not have to be full-time. It may not have to be every year. It could be every year. but that may be a place to start to give the council more information about its oversight role, more transparency into the operations of the department. So just another thing to consider as you're thinking about this.
So I have clearly planted the seed, which was my intent, because I think this would have to be a full agenda item to go much deeper. But I just wanted to plant that seed and let it germinate. Chief, I called on you twice and then we didn't give you a chance to speak. You're under no obligation, but I want to come back to you and make sure you have that opportunity.
Yeah, I think the oversight piece, I think city manager made a valid point in that there are opportunities to bring somebody in just to have that outside view of the organization, to bring in kind of a, another view to make sure, number one, that the organization is doing what it's supposed to for this community. But you don't necessarily have to have these highly structured boards that do that. But I mean, ultimately that'd be up for the council to decide what they're looking for.
Right. All right. Okay. Thank you guys for this. And I hope we have a good
Excuse me, Mayor Pats.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've noticed the raised hand among the attendees and whether you want to address that.
I believe we have taken public comment on all items on our agenda. So this was just wrapping up the conversations. So I think we are all set. But just because I know we'll hear about it in our next meeting, why don't we go ahead and let him speak?
Okay, one moment.
Thank you for taking the public comment, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you for taking public comment, Mr. Mayor, without going to your default position of disallowing it. It seems like, you're learning. Okay, I just wanted to counter what Councilwoman Medina said, that questioning the efficacy of citizen review, police review boards. The efficacy doesn't enter into it. It's just democracy. Democracy is not very efficient, but it's the best, least efficient system that we have. You should not be discussing the efficacy of it. That to me is, that sends a really bad message to the citizens. And then having said that, police universally hate oversight. Of course, every government agency hates to have oversight. It just comes with the territory. So you also don't defer to the police. You don't ask them if they want it because you already know what the answer is going to be no. And then once you have an oversight committee, then the danger is, though, that you have to be willing to accept criticism. And this council has a really hard time with that. But that comes with the territory. People are going to be critical of the police and the department and the council and the city hall. But none of this should enter into, should not be part of how you decide whether or not to do this. Especially the efficacy should not enter into it. Instead, you should just, I think the times being such that they are, the place where we are in the world right now, it screams we need more democracy, not less. Thank you.
Okay. So with that, I will see you guys all in, I think, hour 45. It is 5:03 on my clock. I believe we are adjourned. Thank you guys. I appreciate it. This didn't quite cover everything I'd hoped, but it was a good start.